Hey everyone, welcome. It's December 2022 and Dan Foster is on the phone, desperately trying to secure a new job. He highlights his impressive military background as a member of the United States Army Special Forces, the elite Green Berets. Currently, he's working as a biology teacher, hoping this call will land him his dream position at a laboratory. Back at home, a Christmas party is underway. Dan asks his daughter, Maya, to help carry some items, but his wife, Emmy, urges him to assist with party preparations. Dan, engrossed in his phone call, assures her he'll handle it once he secures the job. Emmy mentions that Maya received a letter from Dan's estranged father. Without a second thought, Dan throws the letter into the trash, declaring that he has lost the right to be a grandfather. He steps outside to finish his call, only to hear the disappointing news that someone else got the job. Feeling extremely upset, he returns inside and sits down to watch the World Cup on TV with his daughter. Dan tells Maya that the players on TV are the best in the world, and she responds by saying she wants to be the best. Dan encourages her, saying that to become the best, she has to do what no one else is willing to do. Suddenly, to everyone's shock, a strange portal appears out of nowhere on the football field, and several soldiers emerge from it. They explain that they are from the year 2051, a time when a global war is raging against an alien race called the White Claws, who invaded Earth and nearly annihilated all life. The woman who speaks pleads for help in the war. Several months later, the world begins sending military forces to the future to assist, but only a quarter of those sent manage to return due to significant losses and resource scarcity. Nations decide to start sending civilians as troops as well, but even fewer of them return, leading people to question if it's worth the risk. One day, Dan is giving a biology class when he realizes that none of his students are paying attention. He decides to engage them by asking what inspires them. Only one student, named Martin, raises his hand and eagerly shares his fascination with volcanoes. However, the other students are confused, questioning the need to study biology when life on Earth seems doomed. Dan responds by telling them that the impending war will occur almost 30 years in the future, and emphasizes that what the world needs now more than ever are scientists to find solutions. Suddenly, Dan receives a message on his phone asking him to confirm his enlistment status. Concerned, he heads to the nearest military processing station, where officials inform him that he is eligible for recruitment because he is projected to die in 7 years. Dan demands an explanation, but the officers remain enigmatic, ignoring his questions. They place a device on his arm, informing him that it will track him and assist him in the future war, and it cannot be removed until he returns from 2051. Later, Dan tells Emmy about what happened. Disturbed by the news, Emmy suggests they run away from the government. Dan admits he doesn't know how to escape, but Emmy insists she knows someone who can help. A few hours later, Dan meets a man named James in an aircraft hangar. They engage in a sarcastic conversation. James is about to start removing the device from Dan's arm when Dan remarks on how strange it is that James has come since he never sought his help before. Dan becomes furious, accusing James of never being there when he needed help. Enraged, Dan tells James to never send letters to Maya again, revealing that James is Dan's father. Upon returning home, Emmy notices that the device is still on Dan's arm and becomes sad. She urges him to inform Maya so she also knows about Dan's situation. Dan goes to the backyard where Maya is digging and explains to her that he is going on a trip. Maya immediately understands that he has been recruited and becomes visibly upset. Dan promises her that he will return and hugs her before leaving. Before jumping into the future, the group of recruits sent with Dan is introduced and begins training in weaponry and first aid to increase their chances of survival. They receive instructions from soldiers from the future. Dan meets Charlie, a scientist who tends to talk a lot when nervous. A guy named Dorian, who is tracking them, tells Charlie to be quiet. Later, Charlie explains to Dan that this is the third time Dorian has traveled to 2051, which surprises Dan since he always hears that no one returns from there. As they continue talking, they realize that everyone in 2051 is very young, and all the people being sent to the war are over 40 years old. They conclude that this must be to avoid some kind of temporal paradox. They are later informed that the White Claws, the alien species they are fighting, disappear every 6 days to rest, a phenomenon the young soldiers from the future refer to as Saturday. This is when new troops are sent to the future and brought back, meaning that everyone sent spends 7 days there before returning. That night, while Dan and Charlie are talking, Charlie shares how his wife was sent on the first jump and never returned. An alarm suddenly goes off, and the young soldiers from 2051 scream that it's not a drill. People rush hastily toward the portal room. Dan asks a lieutenant named Hart what's happening, and she responds that the last research facility in 2051 is under attack, and if they lose it, the war will be lost as well. They enter the portal room, and as the passage to the future activates, Dan shows Charlie how to disable the security lock on his weapon. People start getting sucked into the portal, but just as Dan is about to enter, there's an error in the destination coordinates. Dan and the others end up too high in the sky, and everyone begins to fall to their deaths. Fortunately for Dan, Charlie, and Dorian, they land in a pool of water on top of a skyscraper. But the others are not as lucky. Dan quickly gets out of the water and checks his weapon before heading to the rooftop's edge, observing Miami in ruins. The team now consists of only a few survivors, while the military investigates what went wrong with the time jump. Romeo Command contacts the team, recognizing Dan's military background. They explain that they are going to bomb the area due to the high number of White Claws present. Additionally, Dan is assigned to lead a SEAL-like combat rescue mission to save some scientists isolated in a nearby building surrounded by White Claws. Dan accepts the mission and immediately gathers all the able-bodied team members on the rooftop. As they hit the streets, Dan instructs Nora and Cowan to run to the next block and check for any White Claws. They confirm the path is clear, and the team proceeds cautiously toward the building, noticing many soldiers dead in action around them. Upon arriving at the building, they enter, attempting to navigate to the room where the scientists are supposed to be. Dan is informed by Romeo Command that the White Claws can smell blood from miles away, so they must remain vigilant. Suddenly, they find the team of scientists, all dead. Romeo Command then assigns them to retrieve hard drives and biological samples from the lab. While searching, Nora and Cowan on the ground alert the team that the White Claws are approaching. Dan finds the jars with the samples and is notified that aircraft are being sent to bomb the area in 6 minutes. He orders Khan and Nora to meet them on the 7th floor, where they quickly exit through a fire escape staircase, hoping to avoid the White Claws. Inside the stairwell, they hear strange noises. Suddenly, White Claws emerge from above and begin attacking them, firing at the team. The group tries to run down and escape, but Dan is forced to fight one alone. He eventually gets help from Dorian, who kills the creature and explains that White Claws can only be killed through their necks or bellies. With this knowledge, Dan learns that an aerial attack is imminent, 3 minutes away. Romeo Command sends vehicles to pick up the team, but when they arrive, the White Claws devastate the vehicles, killing several team members in action. As the aerial attack begins, the team, now reduced to 7 people, struggles to escape the explosions while being pursued by White Claws. Khan and Nora get injured in a tunnel where AF-22 Raptors will drop their bombs shortly to delay the White Claws. Cowan and Nora sacrifice themselves, staying behind to fend off the aliens, while the rest of the team escapes. The remaining 5 narrowly manage to get away in time. A day later, Dan wakes up next to Charlie at a military base in the Caribbean. They soon meet Dorian, from whom they learn that they are the only 3 survivors. Dan inquires about the White Claw talon that Dorian wears around his neck, and Dorian explains that it's a keepsake. Dan discovers that Dorian will die of cancer in 6 months, a condition he learned about when Dorian was recruited. Dorian also reveals that his repeated returns are because he wants to die on his own terms. Dan is then summoned to speak with Command Romeo, whom he soon discovers is Colonel Maury Forrester, his daughter. Shocked, he learns that Maury has a PhD in biotechnology from MIT. Proud of her achievements, Dan is stunned when Maury explains that he wasn't brought to the base for a family reunion. Instead, she ensured his recruitment to help with a critical task when the time comes, though she refuses to reveal what it is. They enter a military tent, where Colonel Maury shows Dan that they have discovered a toxin that kills male White Claws, but not females. To develop a toxin that can eliminate all White Claws, they plan to capture a female, and Dan will help them. Dan and Maury are briefed on the mission, traveling to a White Claw nest in a helicopter to capture a female White Claw alive. Maury recounts how the White Claws appeared suddenly, emerging from northern Russia and spreading across the world. Despite extensive searches, no ships, drop sites, or signs of their arrival were ever found on Earth. Dan asks about what happened to their family between 2022 and his supposed death, but Maury dismisses it, stating it's better not to discuss. Upon arriving at a White Claw nest, the military has already cornered a female and is about to cage her. Suddenly, she breaks free and attacks them. Maury descends into the nest through a hole to help the team below control the situation but fails. Meanwhile, Dan sees a horde of male White Claws from the helicopter heading toward the nest. He also descends to assist. Dan grabs one of the female's tentacles, enraging her and tricking her into shooting sharp spines at herself. This self-inflicted attack gives the team the upper hand, allowing them to place the White Claw in the cage. The helicopter takes off with the cage, but as Dan and Maury exit the nest, more White Claws arrive. The team has to run to a military vehicle and open fire while driving to clear a path using a heavy machine gun. Somehow, they manage to escape and reach a beach where they exit the vehicle. Maya is upset because Dan put himself in danger as she needs him alive. Dan tells her that he can't watch his daughter being devoured by the creatures. Maya begins to recount what happened to their family back in 2022. Apparently, Dan left her and her mother. Dan interrupts her, assuring her that he would never do that. Maya continues, growing sad as she explains that they separated and divorced. She had hoped Dan would fix their family and reunite with her, but on her 16th birthday, she received a call that Dan had an accident in the hospital. She watched his last heartbeat on the monitor as doctors tried to revive him. Hearing this, Dan is left speechless and heartbroken. A helicopter arrives and takes them to an ocean base as Dan ponders his future. At the base, Dan meets Maury in her laboratory, where she is synthesizing the toxin by testing thousands of combinations. With a bit of luck, they hope to find a toxin that kills female White Claws by morning. As they near success, Dan asks Maury if she has a way to manufacture the toxin once they find it. She responds enigmatically that she has a way. Dan has 21 hours before being sent back. He expresses his desire to help, to which she replies that it's a job for one person. He then tells her that Emmy, his mother, would be very proud of her if she saw her, just like he is now. The next day arrives, and Dan returns to the laboratory, knowing he's there for a reason. He asks Maya again about his purpose. Finally, she explains that time is running out, and due to depleted resources, she needs Dan to take the toxin back to his time so they can mass produce it. This will prevent the war against the White Claws from happening. As soon as she finishes speaking, the computer informs them that the current test has achieved 100% effectiveness, meaning they have finally found the toxin. Seconds later, the female White Claw awakens and emits a loud scream. Suddenly, they realize the base is being invaded by thousands of White Claws. Dan and Maury grab weapons and run toward the helipad. On the way, they are cornered by several White Claws and have to fight their way through. As they continue running, Maury is hit by a spine and Dan has to help her walk. Simultaneously, an automated voice warns them over the facility speakers that there are 3 minutes left until the time jumpers are sent back. Maury collapses in pain, bleeding heavily, telling Dan that she can't walk and that he should leave her, but he refuses. She apologizes and says she's happy to have seen him like this as a child. Dan becomes desperate and sad as he sees there is less than a minute left until he is sent back. Maya hands him the vial containing the toxin. A White Claw appears and tries to attack them, but the ground suddenly gives way, and the White Claw and Maury start sliding toward the edge. Dan jumps and grabs her, but his hand slips and she falls. In sheer desperation, Dan jumps after her but is instantly teleported back in the middle of his leap after Maury. He wakes up in 2022, holding the vial containing the toxin in his hand, and tells Lieutenant Hart that they must mass-produce the toxin and send it back. However, she informs him that the portal to the future is inactive and no one can return. He sees Charlie next to him, who has also managed to return. When Dan gets home, he emotionally embraces his little Maya, who happily meets him. That night, Dan explains to Emmy that he found Maury in the future and together they made the toxin. He also tells her that no one knew where the White Claws came from. They were just there in the year 2048. Emmy suggests that the creatures could have landed years earlier, which is why there are no records of their arrival or emergence. An idea forms in Dan's head. Dan then visits Dorian at a bar, who has also returned. Dorian agrees to help Dan find a solution to prevent the war from happening. Together, they discover when the White Claws arrived. Dan takes the White Claw talon that Dorian has around his neck and goes to see Charlie, who analyzes the claw. Charlie notices that it has volcanic ash on it, but it's from China, not Russia. Dan is puzzled, wondering how Chinese volcanic ash ended up in Russia. Charlie asks if Dan knows any volcano experts, and Dan remembers someone. They end up in Dan's biology room, where the trio asks Martin how a creature from Russia can have Chinese volcanic ash under its claws. Martin explains that it must be from the Millennium eruption 1,000 years ago, because volcanic ash from that eruption can still be found in deep ice in northern Russia. The team realizes that the White Claws must have arrived during that time and been deeply frozen in the ice. When the ice melts in Russia by 2048, the White Claws are released. After this discovery, they request funding from the United States Air Force for a secret mission in Russia, but the Air Force refuses. Instead, Dan asks his father James to help them. James immediately agrees. They load up a plane and Lieutenant Hart joins them, bringing as much newly produced toxin as possible. Once in northern Russia, at the location they determined for the White Claws, they drive on snowmobiles. Suddenly, they experience interference that prevents them from using their instruments or even the compass. They detonate the ice, entering a fissure that opens up. Eventually, they come across a large object stuck in the ice. They open a hole with a metal saw, and Dan instructs James and Charlie, who are outside, to shoot anything that comes out. They enter and find the central part, where they see an alien race that is not White Claws. They continue and eventually find a compartment containing several White Claws, concluding that the White Claws were cargo. They inject some of them with the toxin to kill them. The other White Claws start to wake up, and before they can inject them, several break free and start heading for the exit. Dan alerts Charlie and James to be ready, managing to stop 3 of them as they exit, but a 4th one escapes. Inside the ship, the team retrieves C4 explosives to blow up the ship if necessary, while Dorian hands the White Claw talon to Dan. Dorian tells Dan to save his daughter and track down the one that escaped. As Dan runs back to the snowmobiles, the others inside the ship encounter an entire colony of White Claws waking up and attacking the team. The ship's crew sacrifices themselves as Dorian shouts and detonates all the explosives, stating that if he's going to die, he'll die on his own terms. The ship explodes, killing all the White Claws inside. Dan returns to James and Charlie, and James informs him that what escaped is a female White Claw. Dan says it's definitely a female, and that they must stop her. He and his father jump on 2 snowmobiles and begin tracking her footprints in the snow. They split up, and shortly after, Dan sees the White Claw running toward his father to attack him. However, James has set a trap. The White Claw bites a decoy, and James starts shooting at it from a distance. This time, the White Claw truly targets him, but Dan manages to hit it with his snowmobile before it reaches James. Both Dan and James shoot at the White Claw, causing it to retreat until it falls off a cliff. They assume it's not dead, and they're right. Suddenly, the White Claw appears out of nowhere and attacks them. It shoots Dan in the leg and pursues him. Both Dan and James manage to shoot its eyes as it gets closer. Dan injects the toxin into its arm, thinking it's over. But the White Claw tears off its own arm, stopping the toxin's effect. It tries to chase Dan, but James cuts his own hand to save his son, causing the White Claw to pursue the scent of his blood. James, not wanting to lose his father, jumps on the creature and stabs it with Dorian's talon. Finally, James gets another dose of the toxin, injects it into the White Claw's mouth, and kicks it off a cliff, killing it once and for all. Exhausted, they lie down in the snow as Charlie joins them. In the final scene, Dan arrives home and gives his family a big hug, then introduces Maury to his grandfather. Throughout, Dan's voiceover assures that he will never leave his family again.